Almost 15 years ago, when I was enjoying the sleep deprivation that can come with having your first child, I watched every episode of Helen Mirren as Jane Tennyson in Prime Suspect, and Robbie Coltrane in Cracker, and the HBO series Rome. I don't remember conversations or work or just about anything else from those first few months of parenthood. I just remember bouncing on the balls of my feet, making soothing noises while watching people decapitate one another on my TV screen. I certainly don't remember anything that might be described as generative or productive. For Tasmanian author Robbie Arnott, that sleepless haze was far more fruitful.
A lot of it I don't remember writing because, you flip a coin and your kid sleeps or it doesn't. It doesn't seem to have anything else to do with it. And she's the best thing that's ever happened to us, but she just didn't sleep. And that's okay. I'm not complaining about that. That's just what happens. So parts of it, I remember just swimming through the fog of tiredness in the time I had to write and just you just got to do it. And so lots of it, I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't really remember doing that.
In those earliest months of parenthood, Robbie Arnott wrote his fourth novel, Dusk, in a kind of dream state. The outcome, this gorgeously drawn tale of loss, redemption and survival, suggests that Robbie's instincts and unconscious have served him very well indeed. In just 3 books, Robbie Arnott has established himself as a writer to trust, in whatever state of mind he's writing. Flames, The Rain Heron and Limberlost were all rapturously reviewed and garnered a hefty swag of award nominations and wins. He's been celebrated as a writer with an uncommon sensitivity to place and landscape, in command of a grounded realism about the natural world that nonetheless makes room for the otherworldly. His clarity about dirt and wind, aches and pains is exceeded only by his almost limitless capacity for awe and wonder. Robbie's ability to depict inarticulate tenderness and love without mawkishness is once again on full display in Dusk, which follows Iris Renshaw and her twin brother Floyd as they make their way into Tasmania's high country, on a quest to hunt down the titular character, a puma upon whose head there is a generous bounty. If he wrote this through a haze of sleeplessness, I don't know what to tell you. Robbie Arnott is pretty bloody clever. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, the show about the books we love and the stories behind them. Fans of Robbie Arnott will find in Dusk many of the qualities he's already made his own. There's plenty of beautifully rendered wild places and creatures here. But while it's every bit his own voice, there are echoes here of other books. Patrick DeWitt's The Sisters Brothers, for example, or Kevin Barry's The Heart in Winter. There's hints of Cormac McCarthy, even Annie Proulx. Because beyond its literary chops, this is a book with definite genre beats. There's mythical elements and tropes from horror, predator on the loose, terrorising locals, but most of all, this is a book with a debt to westerns. Strangers on horseback, hunting for a bounty, and trying to escape their past. So I wanted to start there, to ask about Robbie's experience of westerns. Did he grow up loving them, or is it simply a genre that was useful for the story he wanted to tell in Dusk?
I do enjoy a Western. I'm not a voracious reader of them or watcher of them. It's not a huge part of my cultural life. But there's a part about Westerns and the directness that really appeals to me. I was on holiday in Stanley in northwest Tasmania, and we were in a bar and I picked up a book that was on a bookshelf and it was called Gunsmoke Cure. And I remember just thinking, that's a title.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous, but that's a title. And it just opens with this incredible scene of a shootout in a bar and everything goes terribly wrong for the protagonist, who you assume will go well for, and it all happens in 2 pages. And even though it's not maybe the sort of writing I'd like to emulate, there was a level of directness and emotion in there that I thought was really quite remarkable, that gets sneered upon in a lot of genre conversations. And so I think it just kind of wormed its way into my head. I wouldn't want to write a book that's blunt or didactic or moralistic, but there's a level of directness about motivation and narrative that I think can be, quite arresting.
Part of what interests me about the relationship between you and Westerns, and I think the directness makes perfect sense of it, but I heard an interview with you back around the time Limberlost came out, and you were saying you're not so interested in plotting, by and large. You're more interested in how an event feels than the kind of nuts and bolts of what happens in an event. But there is something about the rhythm and the weight of a Western that is plot forward.
Yeah, very much so. And I quite like that tension in almost being forced to have a plot but not being personally very interested in it, and being invested in characters and landscape and environment and how all these things are intertwined with each other and what effects they're having on each other in a way that's propelled along by a plot. And then having the plot be directed by the environment and the characters rather than them being yanked forward by a particular plot device. I thought that would be really, I guess, challenging and fun to do. So I didn't plot Dusk out. Don't plot any of my novels out. And that probably sounds a bit crazy to some people, but maybe normal to others.
It makes sense. You weren't even conscious for it.
So
why would you?
I was kind of in a waking dream the whole time. But it's a really simple element in that if I know exactly what's going to happen, I'll be too bored to write it. I've got quite a restless mind and I'm quite an impatient person. And if I'm not quite excited by the act of creation while I'm writing and the act of figuring things out as I'm going, then I'll probably get a bit too bored and move on to something else.
Your books have such faculty with stillness that it seems curious to me that you're a restless person. You know, that again and again in your books, characters are able to approach the world at their own rhythm as a way of paying respect to that world even. They're not rushing around. Your characters are rarely restless. Your characters are kind of steady.
Yeah, I think in many ways that's a trait that I probably want to embody. I probably need to see a therapist about. But that is definitely something I feel in connection with the natural world when I go, bushwalking or snorkeling, and you're floating above a reef, or you reach the peak of a mountain or an outcrop, and you do achieve that level of stillness that's hard to achieve elsewhere. And I think that comes through in my work. I mean, one of the problems, I guess, in trying to be a writer who is responding to their own instincts and being instinctive rather than planned, that you're vulnerable to revealing things about yourself you didn't mean on doing, which I'm learning more and more the more books I write. But yeah, achieving that stillness is something that I really value and find quite transformative. And I think I feel so passionate about it, and it means so much to me that it comes out in the characters, who are generally nothing like me, but they find that much easier.
Yeah. There's something comforting about that way to live, especially if it's something that eludes you on a personal level. I mean, the Renshaws are a prime example. They never get to stop moving for a variety of reasons. I think we've got a wonderful line about for a few moments they stood still, for once not rushing, running, not fighting the rough grip of a hard world. That kind of perpetual motion for them isn't a sign of distractedness. It's not a sign for kind of agitation. It's purely survival.
Yeah, it's just a fact of their lives. In order to eat, in order to find shelter, they need to keep moving because they're not accepted anywhere, and they generally have to work twice as hard as anyone else because of their heritage. I think it's an interesting way to write, and hopefully it's an interesting way to read, to have a propulsion in, I guess, in narrative and in characters that's not of their own making, that's something that is forced upon them. And then you are there with them, and they keep moving and they keep doing and changing because they have no choice. I think it's a very old way of telling a story, but I think it's an appealing way, as opposed to sitting with someone who's actively out there trying to make decisions to enliven their lives.
Mm. So if plot's a function of character and then character is a function of landscape, is it reasonable to assume that your starting point for a new novel is almost inevitably a place?
Almost always, yeah, you bang on. And I never deliberately set out to write about a place years in advance. I'll kind of encounter somewhere or spend time somewhere or feel strongly about somewhere and just know that eventually I'll write about it. And I'll kind of wait. This sounds a bit mystical, but I'll kind of wait to figure out what that story is, or let my subconscious figure that out. So with Dusk, I used to camp on a large lake in the Tasmanian Highlands called Lake Echo on a friend's farm when I was a child, and very magical experiences for me up there. And then as an adult, I drove through to west coast of Tasmania quite a few times, and we travelled around there and did a lot of walking around there and up in the Highlands. And at various moments I would think, this is too incredible a place to not write about and not set a novel here. I have no idea what it will be. And it wasn't until I was a few years ago in the South Island of New Zealand, travelling around the fjords there. And it's almost like it was a weird melding of these two places in my mind. And we had our beautiful daughter with us, and she was not sleeping, and I was probably spaced out in Milford Sound somewhere fighting off sandflies. And then it's almost the Tasmanian Highlands, and that place merged into my head. And then I remembered Gunsmoke Cure, and I just started thinking that's what would work. Two people driven to keep moving, driven to keep finding themselves, driven to find somewhere to live. The book kind of then just kicked and clawed its way out of my head.
So how long has that been part of your personal mental makeup, that link between the appreciation of a thing, a place, the love of it, and an impulse that says, this place is too special not to write about?
Look, I think since about 2017, when I was about 25. Before that, I was a very serious, earnest young man who wanted to be a writer. And I didn't think writing about place was very interesting. I had this notion that, well, everywhere's basically the same. People aren't that different wherever you go. And people are what matter in stories. That's what I was always told. So I spent a couple of years writing basically terrible, minimalist realism, Tasmanian Raymond Carver knockoff sort of stuff. And they were really bad. And I don't say that to be, faux humble. They were genuinely quite terrible.
Did you show them to people, or is that your own assessment?
I submitted them to every magazine you think of. I have that, white male middle class confidence, or I just thought someone will like it, And
Good, I was about to chastise you for being too hard on yourself, but go on.
I've got pretty thick skin. And then I was living in Melbourne and having a good time, and my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was in Hobart, and we thought she'd move over, but she graduated from uni and got this wonderful job offer in Hobart. And I was working in an advertising agency in Melbourne, and it was going well, but, I wasn't in love with it. And she said, well, why don't you move back here? It makes more sense. And so I thought I was going to be on the mainland Australia for 20 or 30 years before I could, romantically move back to Tasmania. And I moved back after 2. And the minute I got back there, I started writing my first novel, Flames, because I went for a bushwalk and I thought, I have missed this place so much. I didn't know how much it meant to me. And then it almost kind of poured out of me. And it was only then that I realised that that's what I should be writing about.
Part of what strikes me about the natural world, and you capture this so well, this sense of awe and wonder and kind of reverence for the natural world. But it seems to me that can often be something that's met with kind of the inarticulate, that it's very hard to corral words, sentences, this kind of structure to something that willfully defies it. Do you feel any crisis of measuring up when you put your words up against these places you love so much?
It is tricky at times. I focus quite hard on detail before emotion, because if you jump straight to the emotion a place evokes, then you get very wafty very quickly. And it might feel real to you, but it won't quite be real, because it's very hard to capture a specific emotional experience in language, which is why I do focus quite a lot on descriptive writing, and then imbuing those descriptions with slivers of the sharpest pieces and truest pieces of emotion I can, as opposed to making it all an emotional thing and then saying also the tree was green. That's how I try and do it, because I think that best captures these places by looking at them as if a photographer would and capturing the truth of them and then putting in just the smallest but right amount of emotion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes sense to me that, Tim Winton's a fan of your work, for example, and I think about what Winton does with inarticulate beauty, and I think there is something there that when it lands, it's so incredibly resonant. I'm curious that beyond that with the natural world, the kind of corollary of that seems interesting to me is the role of animals and creatures, because again, here you have these living things with motivation, with agency in your stories. You don't anthropomorphize them, but you're also very careful to give them a voice. How do you get that balance right?
Yeah, the thing I always lean on is animals don't care about people, particularly wild animals. And I think that's something I find doesn't work very well in fiction, is when a connection is formed between a wild animal and person, and then it serves as a lesson and a teaching experience for the character, and then the animal is there as a function to serve humanity, and even if it's not deliberately done, that's how it comes out. And I think it's best to write again about animals with ultimate truth, which is they are beautiful and savage, and they do not care one iota for humans at all, apart from what they can get out of them. because animals are surviving. And focusing on that survival aspect helps them come true on the page, I hope. And I think hopefully just my own fascination with animals as opposed to people, and the differences between them and some of the similarities. It just interests me. I've learned to lean into your interests as an artist and a novelist because you can't fake passion.
No.
And like readers are clever. And I don't just say that just to be nice to anyone who picks up a book, but generally, like most people these days are scrolling on their phone and half watching TV and half looking at their phone and half listening to something. And the act of actually picking up a book, especially a novel, like requires a lot of effort, and it's not as easy as most entertainment options are these days. Anyone who's going to that effort, you have a pretty implicit contract with them that they're going to go with you. And if they don't, they can put it down. So I think trusting that people will realise this might be not what they're expecting, but they can feel your passion.
When we return, Robbie reveals the simple rules that he writes by and explains why he sees himself not just as an Australian writer, but as a Tasmanian one. We'll be right back.
Everyone remembers the first step on the moon. What if it had been the last? This Kingdom of Dust by David Dyer reimagines the moon landing from the eyes of Buzz, stuck on the moon, his wife Joan, trapped on Earth by society's expectations of her, and Aquarius, a journalist compelled to craft a story he doesn't want to write. This Kingdom of Dust reframes what the moon landing meant for all humankind. This Kingdom of Dust is out now.
As America heads into its presidential election with ever-increasing mistrust and misinformation, the question on everyone's mind is, what went wrong? Journalist Nick Bryant's best-selling book, The Forever War, argues that the roots of the hate we see in America today can be found in its troubled past, and how the rise of Donald Trump has been 250 years in the making. The Forever War offers a perceptive look at America's unending conflict with itself. The Forever War by Nick Bryant is out now.
At the heart of this book, not for the first time in your books, a sibling relationship is crucial. And Iris and Floyd know each other so well that the shorthand they use and the ways in which bluntness and affection play out are really, really beautifully captured in this book, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I found them such a fascinating pair to write about. In that I initially didn't imagine their relationship at the start of the book. I imagined it would be a really interesting way to follow a novel by essentially having two protagonists but always staying close to one, and really getting to know one of them by sticking third-person close narration to them, and the other one always being there but almost at arm's length, and coming to know them each through the way they interacted with each other, and then having a brief dive to the other protagonist. But as I created the characters I was going, the depth of love and tension and anger and mistrust and devotion to each other all kind of spooled out. And it was actually really enjoyable to write and painful at other times. I do sometimes wonder what my brother and my sister think of, I guess, most of my books, actually. But
they leave you guessing? They're not giving you, like, robust commentary in a WhatsApp group?
A little bit, yeah. They read them. They're always eager to read them. They're very proud of me. They're not really like me. They're much more kind of analytical people. So they find me a bit bizarre, but, you know, they're very happy that it's working out. And the fact that I write about siblings is as confusing to them as it is to me, but here we all are.
Do you have a consciousness, like, I'm always delighted when Richard Flanagan's at great pains to insist he's not an Australian writer, he's a Tasmanian writer. Do you feel a similar kind of sense of that difference being an important defining one?
For all my sins, I think I do.
Yeah.
Not out of... I don't have any more of a problem with mainland Australia than anyone else should. But growing up as a Tasmanian, and I'm sure everyone listening to this, it's part of a joke. It's like incest jokes and nobody can read, nobody can write. It's boring. There's nothing to do, sort of stuff. And it's all generally said in good humour, but you just get so used to it. And then we have this like Bond villain who sets up a giant art lair in Hobart, and suddenly Hobart's cool.
Yeah.
And everyone wants to come down and visit, and everyone wants to buy a condo in Hobart. And it makes us all very wary because we're thinking like, how long is this going to last until you're all making fun of us again? So it does set you apart from mainland Australia a little bit.
What are the rules you set for yourself when you write? I mean, you write largely in a realist mode, but then you also allow yourself the freedom to embrace more things in heaven and earth. Do you have an idea of how grounded you have to be, what that ratio should be?
Not necessarily. Whenever I do anything that veers into magical or particularly imaginative, the simple rule I have is like, if it's not real, do I want it to be? And can I believe it almost to be? Like, do I really want that as a reader? Would I love that to be something rather than, is this just quite a sparkling piece of imagination and am I just essentially showing off? So no showing off is my biggest rule. No self-indulgence, because I don't think that does anything for anybody. And I guess my other one is just no dead sentences. Obviously, you can't have everything be you turn around a corner and a man's with a gun's there, but just no dead weight is what I try and avoid.
Yeah. One of the things in Dusk in particular is not just a kind of reverence for the landscape, but it's the brutality of the landscape. You know, the Renshaws reflect over their life for the many places they've been. And again, the thing that comes through is that they're places of kind of great violence. And I'm curious about the extent to which that was a deliberate decision based on the story you were telling and the genre, or whether you think that kind of underlying violence is an important part of understanding the physical, the natural world.
Yeah, I do definitely the latter. It wasn't so much a decision I made as looking into this novel is set in roughly historical times, let's say somewhere in the late 1800s if we were to be forced to put a date on it. And looking at how people actually live, particularly outside of large civilization centres, a lot of what I think I describe is just pretty straightforward. And we're at a remove from that now, particularly in large cities. And I think it's just necessary to include that in because that informs how people behaved and views they had and what they did and why they did it, for good or for bad. And I think it's a level of detail in there that some people might find a little confronting. I don't think it's particularly confronting, but I'm odd. But I think it's necessary in order to understand the characters and societies of these places. Civilization hasn't moved on from things like this as much as we think it has. So when you read a book like in Dusk or maybe one of my other books where maybe someone is treated with violence or is enacting violence on the natural world, it's not that far from where we've come from and where we are.
No. Is that complicated by or added to by, as you say, the book has a historical setting? If we're talking about Tasmania of the kind of late 19th century, the proximity to violence in relation to land is incredibly acute. You know, that's within a generation, you know, the level of atrocities that were going on there. Does that give you as a writer pause or anxiety to be kind of playing in that sandbox?
I think if anything, it gives me a sense of responsibility. Because you're looking at a period of history and not writing about that, at least on some level, then you're doing something very odd. It's the huge and defining feature of, let's say Tasmania, but honestly Australia and almost every colonial territory of the former British Empire and other European empires, is the atrocities of colonisation. And the fact that people don't like talking about it and people like it not to be referred to or like to kind of avert their gaze, I think is a very strange thing. When I say responsibility to refer to it, I just mean in order to tell the truest version of fiction possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
To not include it would be not only the wrong thing to do, but just bizarre. Why would you bother even writing about it? So I think whether it hangs large or small in the backdrop of a novel, I think it just should be there because why else are you doing it? And it definitely crops up in the book, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, those twin poles of violence and horror on the one hand and beauty and wonder on the other, I mean, that's your quintessential Robbie Arnott novel right there in the space, careening between those two.
Yeah, I suppose so. And, you know, I feel compelled to write about it and to look into it and to, I guess, interrogate it in fiction because it's something that's unresolved in Australian society today. I mean, we have absolutely no reconciliation in this country, and it's very hard to imagine a sensible or harmonious path forward without any of it. And so, it comes out in this book, and it comes out in my work because, why wouldn't it? I come from a culture in northern Tasmania of people who just don't like talking about the frontier conflict, and they just basically say it didn't happen, or if it did, stop whinging. And I wasn't there. It's nothing to do with me. Get over it. And that's a stance that's incredibly comfortable where I'm from. And it just makes my head spin because, not only is it a level of denial that seems childish, it's also just the level of not even wanting to talk about it. I won't go on too much about it. But I guess it becomes present in the work because I don't see how it couldn't be. It's strange that all this stuff is happening and it's come out of me writing a novel set about some children of bush rangers hunting a puma in Tasmanian highlands. But there we go.
It's never a straight line, these things.
No. Maybe if I planned these things out, it would make a lot more sense.
No, you'd enjoy yourself so much less.
Yeah.
Robbie Arnott, Dusk is absolutely a wonderful read, and I imagine your legion of fans are going to love it too. Thank you so much for joining us today.
That's so kind of you, and thanks so much for having me.
Robbie Arnott's latest novel, Dusk, is available at all good bookstores now. Before we get out of here, I want to let you know what I've been reading this week, and it's a work of non-fiction. It's called Paris in Ruins, Love, War and the Birth of Impressionism, and it's by Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic Sebastian Smee. Smee's Australian, currently based in the US, and is one of the world's best arts writers. But it turns out he's also one of the most extraordinary historians as well. It looks at political turmoil in Paris from 1870 to 1871, and it takes in everyone from Manet to Monet, Pissarro to Renoir, Degas. It's just phenomenally good and very addictive reading. I can't recommend it enough. You can get Paris in Ruins or any of the other books we've talked about in this episode at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends, rate and review us. It helps a lot. Next week on Read This, I sit down with Nadie Simpson to discuss her new novel, The Bellbird.
I wrote a list of things I was not going to do for this book. And so then did not write a thing for a year. And once it became, I've got to write something here. It's cool, I've gone long enough not writing. I need to start. And I started breaking my rules. And that was the beginning point for an evolving story.
Read This is a Schwartz Media production, made possible by our generous sponsors, ARA Group. It's produced and edited by Clara Ames, with mixing by Travis Evans and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.